On 27 October 1944, deep within the rugged terrain of the Vosges Mountains in eastern France, conditions had deteriorated into a kind of misery that few soldiers could have imagined. For 72 hours, unbroken sheets of cold autumn rain had swept across the ridgelines. In the thick conifer forests, where the trees grew so tightly together that daylight barely reached the ground, visibility collapsed to just a few paces. Temperatures hovered just above the point of freezing, and the pathways that wound across the mountains turned into flowing channels of slippery mud. It was somewhere inside this bleak environment that 275 soldiers of the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment, the Alamo Regiment of Texas, dug themselves into shallow, waterlogged depressions in the earth. Surrounded on nearly all sides by German units cut off from resupply, and with their ammunition and rations rapidly dwindling, the battalion had entered the third day of what felt like a slow-closing trap. What had begun as an aggressive push forward had turned into a crisis born out of one of the most debated command decisions in the U.S. Army's Second World War history. As German artillery steadily trimmed the battalion's shrinking perimeter, firing with a deliberateness that suggested they were in no hurry, the stranded Texans realized that relief could come only from an unexpected source. A regiment composed almost entirely of Japanese-American troops, many of whom were fighting while their families remained confined in U.S. internment camps. Over the next 6 days, these soldiers of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team undertook a rescue effort so demanding that it became legend. Their assault through fortified German positions resulted in more casualties than the number of men they ultimately brought back alive. More than 800 casualties were incurred to liberate the 211 survivors of the trapped battalion. The cost was staggering, but the outcome forced both German commanders and the American public to confront uncomfortable truths, first about the intense combat capability of the 442nd, and second about the contradiction between their battlefield heroism and the prejudice still directed toward their families at home. Historians rank the rescue among the 10 most consequential ground engagements in U.S. Army history, emblematic of bravery, flawed leadership, and the extraordinary lengths one group of soldiers went to in order to prove loyalty to a nation that had doubted them. The chain of events had begun on 24 October 1944, when Major General John E. Dahlquist, commander of the 36th Infantry Division, issued an order that contradicted several basic principles of battlefield planning. He directed the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry to push beyond established American lines and advance into the tangled forests of the Vosges with the aim of capturing high ground near Bifontaine and severing German supply routes. Within the battalion, officers quickly recognized the inherent danger. Lieutenant Martin Higgins, responsible for battalion operations, noted that the unit would be advancing without flank protection, without a ready reserve force, and along a single vulnerable supply route, a narrow logging road that could easily be severed by even a modest German counterattack. Nevertheless, Dahlquist, operating from a headquarters well removed from the front, pressed the issue.
By midday on the 24th, the Texans had pushed nearly 4 miles beyond friendly positions and secured a wooded ridge known as Hill 205. They began preparing defensive positions among the pines, expecting the remainder of their regiment to arrive and reinforce them. That reinforcement never materialized. Unbeknownst to them, the German 19th Army under General Friedrich Wiese had anticipated precisely this kind of overextended American thrust. German units had deliberately fallen back in certain sections, creating what military planners refer to as a calculated encirclement zone. Once the battalion was deep enough, multiple German formations moved into action. Troops from the 201st Mountain Battalion occupied higher ground that dominated the American position. The 933rd Grenadier Regiment struck the narrow supply road, closing off the battalion's only route to the rear. Additional German forces sealed remaining escape corridors. Within a matter of hours, between 6,000 and 8,000 German soldiers had effectively surrounded the isolated Americans. The Germans held a significant tactical advantage. They had spent weeks fortifying the Vosges, constructing bunker systems, laying extensive minefields, including wooden mines that escaped metal detection, and preparing artillery positions along reverse slopes where American counterfire could not reach them. Among their most devastating tools was the use of tree-burst artillery, in which shells were set to detonate in the forest canopy. The explosions showered troops below with lethal shards of metal and splintered wood, rendering even the most carefully dug foxholes only marginally effective. By the time the situation became fully understood at higher headquarters, the 1st Battalion was already encircled, low on supplies, and fighting merely to hold its perimeter. The stage had been set for one of World War II's most grueling rescue operations, an operation that would test not only the endurance of the rescuers, but also the moral foundations of the nation they fought for. Within the first day of being cut off, the battalion's situation deteriorated rapidly. German troops pressed in from several axes, testing the perimeter with small assaults while keeping up an almost unbroken barrage of mortar rounds and artillery fire. The Americans, who had advanced believing the push would be brief, carried only standard ammunition loads and 3 days' worth of rations. Before long, water became the most urgent concern. The only place to refill canteens was a narrow stream roughly 60 yards beyond their defensive line, fully exposed to German machine gun nests watching that entire stretch. After nightfall, soldiers would inch their way through the mud on their stomachs, hoping to scoop water into canteens or even steal helmets as tracer fire sliced through the darkness above them. Many who crawled out never returned.
Repeated attempts to resupply the surrounded troops from the air produced almost nothing. P-47 fighters from the 365th Fighter Group tried to drop parachuted bundles, but the combination of thick woods, poor visibility, and enemy positions ensured that most packages either drifted into German hands or vanished somewhere in the forest. Out of numerous drops over multiple days, the trapped unit recovered only a few crates. On October 26th, elements of the 141st Infantry made the first ground effort to relieve them. They advanced less than 800 yards before running directly into fortified German lines that halted them completely. The following day, the 142nd Infantry attempted a flanking maneuver through a nearby valley only to enter a mined killing zone that was already registered for German artillery. Heavy losses forced them to pull back almost immediately. Inside the perimeter, radio operator Erwin Blonder kept up sporadic communication with division headquarters using the battalion's final working SCR-300 set. Battery reserves were so low they could afford only 2 brief transmissions a day. As time went on, those messages grew increasingly urgent, pleading for ammunition, medical supplies, and relief forces. By October 27th, with every conventional rescue attempt failing, General Dahlquist issued the order that would define much of the later criticism of his command. He directed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team to break through at once and reach the encircled battalion. According to his aide's notes, his instruction was simple and absolute: get them out at any cost. The 442nd had just come off 9 straight days of brutal fighting during the liberation of Bruyères and Bifontaine. Their casualty count was already severe, and they had been given only a day and a half in reserve, far too little time to assimilate replacements, repair weapons, or recover any strength. Many of the men still wore lightweight summer uniforms despite the freezing mountain weather. This unit was unlike any other in the U.S. Army, a segregated formation made up almost entirely of Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans. While they were fighting and dying in Europe, roughly 120,000 Japanese Americans, including many of their families, remained behind barbed wire in internment camps in the western United States, held without trial under Executive Order 9066. The 442nd lived by its unofficial motto, "Go for broke," a Hawaiian pidgin phrase meaning to stake everything on one decisive effort. They had already built an extraordinary record in Italy, earning more decorations in half a year than most units accumulated over the course of the entire war. Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Miller, commanding the 100th Infantry Battalion attached to the 442nd, protested Dahlquist's demand. His men were exhausted, under-equipped for winter, and in dire need of rest. Dahlquist dismissed the objection, stating that American soldiers were trapped and dying, and the 442nd would be the ones to reach them.
At 0400, on October 28, the regiment began its push forward. The plan positioned the 100th Battalion on the right, the 2nd Battalion on the left, and the 3rd Battalion held in reserve. Fire support would come from the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, though the dense woods and continual fog made accurate coordination nearly impossible. Conditions along the forested ridges were nightmarish. Rain had turned the ground into a churned mass of mud, and the Germans had spent weeks constructing a layered defense of mines, interlocking machine gun fields of fire, and precisely targeted artillery zones. Just after dawn, the advance made first contact. Scouts from Company E moved directly into a concealed ambush. German MG-42s erupted at extremely close range, cutting down several men within moments and signaling the brutal fight that lay ahead. The reaction of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was instantaneous and brutally direct. Instead of pulling back to establish a defensive posture or waiting for supporting fire, the Nisei infantrymen fixed bayonets and advanced straight at the German line. The maneuver ran counter to standard U.S. Army doctrine, which generally favored coordinated firepower and deliberate tactics over head-on attacks against fortified positions. Yet the soldiers of the 442nd had repeatedly learned in earlier battles that determined, close-quarters pressure could unsettle defenders who relied on distance, fire superiority, or the expectation of American withdrawal after sustaining casualties. German troops, accustomed to U.S. units disengaging when losses mounted, were mentally unprepared for opponents who continued pressing forward despite the growing number of wounded. On the regiment's opposite flank, Company K encountered a dense minefield. The initial explosion tore a soldier's foot off at the ankle, and when medics rushed toward him, additional mines detonated in quick succession. Progress became impossible until engineers inched ahead on their stomachs, carefully probing for buried charges using bayonets rather than specialized equipment. By the time darkness approached, the 442nd had advanced less than a mile, but the costliness of the day did yield a strategic discovery. They had pinpointed the primary German defensive belt, a chain of ridges that blocked the route to the surrounded Lost Battalion. The fiercest fighting of the campaign unfolded on October 29th and 30th. The central objective, Hill 617, dominated every approach to the trapped Texans and had been transformed by the Germans into a layered defensive complex. 3 trench systems, reinforced pillboxes, and artillery pre-registered on all approaches made the ridge a near impenetrable obstacle. At dawn, the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion commenced a bombardment that lasted 3 hours and delivered more than 4,000 rounds onto the heights. Despite the intensity of the shelling, many bunkers built into the reverse slope remained functional. When the 442nd resumed its advance, they were met by concentrated machine gun and rifle fire. What followed entered the annals of military history. As the assault slowed under heavy resistance, individual soldiers took extraordinary risks. Private Barney Hajiro, newly assigned to the regiment and hailing from Hawaii, rose into the open and advanced through intersecting machine gun streams. He destroyed 2 German machine gun emplacements and eliminated 2 snipers, continuing the attack even after being wounded in the shoulder. His willingness to move forward under impossible conditions spurred his company to surge ahead. Elsewhere on the battlefield, Private George Joe Sakato performed a similarly decisive action. With his platoon in danger of being pushed back, Sakato charged a German defensive cluster held by 12 enemy soldiers. He killed 12, wounded 2 more,
and captured 4, reversing the momentum of the fight and enabling his unit to break through.
These acts of courage helped the 442nd crack the German line on Hill 617, but the human toll was shocking. Company K, which began the operation with 186 men, was reduced to just 17 riflemen capable of fighting. Company I suffered even more severe attrition, leaving only 8 battle-effective soldiers out of its original 185. At approximately 1600 hours on October 30, Technical Sergeant Teo Senzaki became one of the first soldiers to reach the isolated Texans. His initial remark, "Need any cigarettes?" was later remembered as a darkly humorous indication of the regiment's exhaustion and relief at finally reaching the encircled unit. The link-up, however, marked only the midpoint of the mission. The trapped battalion still had to be extracted through roughly 2 miles of territory under German control. Almost immediately, German forces counterattacked in an attempt to seal the gap the 442nd had opened. Fierce fighting persisted through the night of October 30 and into the following days. The evacuation process began with the most severely wounded. Nisei soldiers carried stretchers along narrow forest paths seeded with mines, all while facing intermittent sniper fire and calibrated artillery strikes. Each trip consumed hours as litter teams were forced to pause to take cover or rest. Over the next 2 days, the remaining ambulatory wounded and the still able fighters of the lost battalion were guided back through the precarious corridor. Throughout the extraction, the 442nd held the passage open against repeated German attempts to cut it off, often engaging in close-quarters combat when ammunition ran low, using knives, entrenching tools, and rifle stocks to keep the enemy at bay. By November 1, the evacuation was complete. All 211 surviving members of the lost battalion had been brought to safety. The 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry had endured significant losses during their encirclement, suffering 64 men killed. However, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team incurred far heavier casualties, with over 800 soldiers killed, wounded, or missing within just 6 days of combat. On November 12, 1944, General Dahlquist summoned the 442nd for a formal recognition ceremony, anticipating the presence of the regiment in full strength, roughly 3,000 troops. To his shock, fewer than 900 soldiers formed up. Witnesses recount that Dahlquist asked Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Miller about the absence of the majority of the regiment. Miller's reply has since become emblematic of the regiment's sacrifice. "General, this is the regiment. The rest are either dead or hospitalized."
The enormous toll sparked immediate scrutiny of Dahlquist's decisions. Critics questioned why he had deployed the 1st Battalion in such a vulnerable position and why he had assigned the understrength 442nd to the rescue mission when larger, better-equipped units were available. Many historians and veterans have argued that Dahlquist may have regarded the Japanese-American soldiers as more expendable than white units. The debate intensified when, despite the staggering losses, he ordered the regiment to continue offensive operations for another 9 days before allowing them to recover. Years later, when Dahlquist approached Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Singles at Fort Bragg and suggested, "Let bygones be bygones," Singles reportedly refused to shake his hand in front of other officers. While the bravery demonstrated in the rescue of the lost battalion merited the nation's highest honors, none of the soldiers initially received the Medal of Honor. Instead, some were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, even though their deeds met the criteria for the higher distinction, a reflection of the systemic discrimination Asian American troops faced during World War II. It took more than 5 decades to rectify this injustice. In the 1990s, Congress initiated a review of Distinguished Service Cross awards given to Asian American veterans. The investigation confirmed widespread bias. On June 21, 2000, President Bill Clinton awarded the Medal of Honor to 22 Asian American World War II veterans, including posthumous recognition for Bonnie Hajiro and George Sakato for their valor during the Lost Battalion rescue. Clinton remarked on the occasion that the nation had rarely been served so well by a people it had treated so poorly. The numbers from the Lost Battalion operation paint a stark picture. 211 men of the 1st Battalion survived, while the 442nd suffered over 800 casualties, a nearly 4-to-1 ratio. They fought 6 days to reach the trapped battalion, and then 9 additional days of continued engagement before respite. Yet statistics cannot fully convey the human dimension. These were soldiers whose families were confined in internment camps by the government they served. They volunteered to fight for a country that often questioned their loyalty, enduring losses that would have overwhelmed most units, all to demonstrate their patriotism. The psychological burden on survivors was immense. Many endured what modern medicine would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though wartime support for mental health was minimal. The Japanese cultural principle of gaman, the ability to endure suffering with patience and dignity, meant that most carried their anguish silently. German military reports and post-war analyses underscored that the enemy forces were unprepared for the 442nd's ferocity. The soldiers repeatedly assaulted fortified positions head-on, absorbed casualties that would have halted any other advance, and continued fighting even when seriously injured. General Friedrich Wiese noted in his after-action reports that the 442nd's willingness to disregard their own losses was unprecedented in his experience with American forces.
In sum, the Lost Battalion rescue exemplifies extraordinary heroism under impossible conditions, revealing the courage and resilience of soldiers who were both undervalued and underappreciated by the nation they served. German observers noted with surprise that even severely wounded soldiers of the Nisei units continued to fight relentlessly. Entire squads maintained organizational integrity despite sustaining casualties that exceeded 3/4 of their numbers, and the intensity of hand-to-hand engagements surpassed anything the Germans had encountered previously. The setback in the Vosges Mountains compelled German command to rethink their assumptions regarding American combat effectiveness, as well as the perceived value and reliability of racial minority soldiers in the U.S. Army. The Japanese-American troops, often dismissed as inferior, had successfully penetrated defensive positions considered impenetrable by their opponents. The bond formed between the rescued soldiers from Texas and their Nisei liberators became one of the most enduring legacies of the campaign. Many of the Texans had grown up in the racially segregated South and had never before met Japanese Americans in person. The shared ordeal of battle transformed initial wariness into enduring camaraderie. In recognition of their extraordinary efforts, Texas Governor John Connally in 1962 conferred honorary Texan status upon every member of the 442nd Infantry Regiment. Veterans of both the Texas units and the 442nd maintained close ties for decades, attending one another's reunions, weddings, and funerals. When waves of anti-Japanese sentiment arose during economic downturns in subsequent decades, those who had been part of the Lost Battalion were among the first to publicly defend Japanese Americans, fully aware of the sacrifices their comrades had made to demonstrate their loyalty. The rescue of the Lost Battalion had implications far beyond its immediate military significance. The courage and persistence exhibited by the 442nd rendered it impossible to continue rationalizing discriminatory policies against Japanese Americans. How could the nation claim that these soldiers were disloyal citizens when they had endured staggering losses to save white servicemen? The 442nd went on to become the most highly decorated unit of its size and duration in U.S. military history. Their accolades included 21 Medals of Honor, awarded mostly in later years, 29 Distinguished Service Crosses, 588 Silver Stars, 5,200 Bronze Stars, over 4,000 Purple Hearts, and 8 Presidential Unit citations. The regiment's extraordinary service laid essential groundwork for eventual redress for Japanese American internment. In 1988,
President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, formally apologizing for wartime internment and providing restitution to surviving internees. Many veterans of the 442nd played a pivotal role in advocating for and securing this recognition. Scholars and military historians continue to debate the necessity of the Lost Battalion rescue and whether the repeated deployment of the 442nd constituted a form of institutional discrimination. Evidence points to a mixture of operational necessity and systemic prejudice. General Dahlquist repeatedly assigned the 442nd to perilous missions, denying requests for relief or reinforcements. Critically, larger, fully rested units were available that could have undertaken the rescue, yet the understrength 442nd was chosen instead. Some historians argue this was because they were the most capable unit at hand. Others suggest political calculations played a role, believing that casualties among Japanese Americans would attract less public outcry than losses in white units.
Regardless of motive, the 442nd could not decline the mission without reinforcing doubts about their loyalty. They were, in effect, constrained by prejudice just as the Lost Battalion had been trapped by enemy forces. The episode of the Lost Battalion rescue offers enduring lessons about the meaning of citizenship, loyalty, and the human cost of discrimination. It underscores how questioning allegiance based on ancestry undermines military effectiveness and contradicts American ideals. It also highlights the disproportionate burden marginalized groups often bear to affirm their belonging. Above all, it demonstrates that American identity is defined not by heritage, but by service, commitment, and sacrifice. The Nisei soldiers redefined what it meant to be patriotic. For them, loyalty to the United States was not about unquestioning obedience, but about striving to uphold the nation's core principles even when the country itself failed to live up to them. Their actions during World War II, particularly in the rescue of the Lost Battalion, highlighted the extraordinary effectiveness that diversity can bring to military units. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, forged from a shared experience of discrimination and marginalization, displayed cohesion and determination that often surpassed that of traditional units. Their drive to demonstrate their worth led to feats that went beyond ordinary expectations of bravery. As years went by, the number of those who had witnessed the campaign firsthand steadily declined. Veterans of both the 442nd and the Lost Battalion carried enduring physical wounds and psychological scars from the battles they endured. Yet alongside this suffering was a profound sense of solidarity, a bond formed in the crucible of those harrowing days. Martin Higgins, a member of the Lost Battalion who had sent urgent radio calls while trapped behind enemy lines, maintained close relationships with the men who had come to rescue him, friendships that lasted until the end of his life. Reflecting on the courage of his rescuers, he remarked, "They risked their lives to save us while their own families were confined in internment camps. That goes beyond bravery. It is a type of heroism I can never fully comprehend." Veteran Susito of the 442nd echoed a similar sentiment, emphasizing the universality of their mission. "We climbed that mountain to rescue fellow American soldiers, not soldiers of any particular state or background, American soldiers. That's who we were too, despite everything, American soldiers." The operation to save the Lost Battalion has since become a case study in military academies, illustrating the power of small unit tactics combined with relentless perseverance. At the United States Military Academy at West Point, a plaque commemorates the 442nd, stating, "These soldiers demonstrated that extraordinary courage can be found in ordinary individuals." Yet the broader impact of their service extends beyond military strategy. The sacrifices made by the 442nd played a significant role in reshaping American conceptions of citizenship and inclusion. Their unwavering commitment challenged the notion that loyalty could be judged by one's race or ancestry. Following the war, many veterans of the 442nd leveraged the moral authority earned on the battlefield to advocate for civil rights. Daniel Inouye, who lost an arm fighting in Italy, went on to become Hawaii's first U.S. congressman and served nearly 50 years in the Senate.
Alongside him, Spark Matsunaga, another veteran of the 442nd, also represented Hawaii in the Senate. Together, they were pivotal in securing redress for Japanese Americans who had been unjustly interned.
The story of the Lost Battalion rescue also underscores the national consequences of prejudice. The disproportionate casualties suffered by the 442nd were in part a result of the need to prove loyalty through exceptional sacrifice. The nation lost countless citizens whose potential contributions were cut short by systemic discrimination. Furthermore, the battle revealed flaws in military leadership when bias influenced operational decisions. Major General John E. Dahlquist's apparent willingness to expend Japanese American lives more readily than those of white soldiers led to needless losses and remains a blemish on his record. Nevertheless, from this injustice emerged a powerful testament to the resilience of American ideals. The Nisei soldiers did not fight for an unblemished America, but for the vision of a country capable of living up to its highest values, a nation that, at its best, could transcend the prejudices of the time and fulfill the promise of liberty and justice for all. On October 30th, 1944, at 4 p.m., Technical Sergeant T.O. Senzaki of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team emerged from dense forest terrain and finally reached the encircled Lost Battalion. After nearly a week of relentless combat, the deadliest the European theater had witnessed up to that point, and following more than 800 casualties sustained by the rescuing force, the trapped unit was relieved. The weary soldiers from Texas, many of whom had never encountered an Asian American in their lives, were stunned to see their rescuers were Japanese Americans. Despite this unfamiliarity, these men had endured extraordinary losses to save fellow Americans. This event exemplifies the intersection of prejudice and selfless heroism, assumptions challenged by reality, and Americans risking everything for one another regardless of race. The operation highlights the duality of the American experience during World War II. On one hand, it reveals a nation that demanded proof of loyalty from its citizens while simultaneously confining their families in internment camps. On the other, it showcases the nation's potential for courage and unity when citizens act beyond racial prejudice, forming bonds through shared sacrifice. In recognition of their valor, the Go for Broke Monument was unveiled in Los Angeles in 2000, commemorating all Japanese American soldiers who served in World War II. The memorial records over 16,000 names, including more than 700 who died in combat. At the dedication, then Secretary of Veterans Affairs Herschel Gober remarked, "These men fought on two fronts, one against fascism overseas and another against discrimination at home. They prevailed on both, at a cost that should humble every American." The monument bears the motto of the 442nd, "Go for Broke." Yet perhaps the most poignant acknowledgement comes from the Lost Battalion veterans themselves, who ensured the names of their Japanese American rescuers were inscribed on their own memorials. As one Texan survivor reflected, "They are brothers. They earned that with their blood." The rescue of the Lost Battalion extends beyond tactical history to define a significant moment in American identity. It affirmed that heroism cannot be determined by skin color, that loyalty is not bound to ancestry, and that the deepest expressions of patriotism can come from those most marginalized. German officers who underestimated the Nisei troops learned that courage knows no racial boundaries. American commanders who regarded them as expendable discovered that every life holds equal weight. The Texan soldiers, unacquainted with Japanese Americans prior to this encounter, recognized that true comradeship is forged through shared struggle rather than shared heritage. Most importantly, this episode demonstrated that America's most steadfast defenders may arise from its overlooked or discriminated communities. It underscored that national strength is found in diversity, and that citizenship is not defined by unquestioning service to a nation, but by the effort to make that nation better. Military historians continue to study this episode as one of the most remarkable in American combat history. The tactical feat, penetrating entrenched German positions despite overwhelming odds, remains noteworthy, but the moral resonance surpasses the battlefield achievement. The operation showed that core American principles, justice, equality, and liberty, could triumph over domestic prejudice. It proved that the hallmark of America is not perfection, but the ability to redeem itself through acts of courage and self-sacrifice. From a purely operational standpoint, the cost was immense. Over 800 casualties to rescue 211 men, a ratio that defies conventional military prudence. Yet in terms of character and national meaning, the rescue of the Lost Battalion stands as an enduring testament to the strength, resilience, and capacity for moral courage that defined the American story.
History often evaluates events through lenses very different from tactical military assessments. Certain victories are invaluable regardless of cost. Certain positions must be held no matter the price. Some ideals demand defense, even at the risk of death. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team grasped this principle completely. Their ascent of the Vosges Mountains was motivated not only by the urgent need to rescue the trapped battalion, but also by the broader imperative of upholding America's claim to ethical leadership. They confronted not merely enemy forces, but the societal biases that questioned their legitimacy as Americans. Their sacrifices were not confined to achieving battlefield success. They were affirmations of the principle that every citizen is entitled to equality. The mission to free the Lost Battalion illustrates the complicated nature of American identity and the transformative power of selfless action. It underscores that citizenship is validated through commitment and contribution rather than by mere accident of birth. It demonstrates how prejudice undermines the very nation it purports to protect. And it shows that the nation's resilience stems from the collective determination of its diverse citizens to pursue a shared destiny. In the rugged terrain of the Vosges, the 442nd gave everything they had without hesitation. Their effort went beyond saving 211 men trapped by enemy lines. They reinforced the moral integrity of the nation itself. Even amid widespread distrust and discrimination, their courage commanded admiration from allies and foes alike. Today, the forest has reclaimed the hills they fought over. Trenches are obscured by foliage, and bunkers have fallen into ruin. Yet, the memory of those young soldiers endures. Men who scaled impossible heights, shed their blood for those who doubted them, and died defending a nation that had not yet recognized their worth. These were the 442nd, Japanese Americans, soldiers who embodied patriotism through action. Their heroism continues to resonate, reminding each generation that freedom entails responsibility, that the privileges of citizenship require active participation, and that the highest expression of devotion to one's country is striving to make it live up to its ideals. In the dense forests of the Vosges, a community once marginalized demonstrated that loyalty is proven through deeds, that bravery transcends race, and that the strength of a nation lies in the willingness of all its people to defend democracy collectively. While the Lost Battalion was physically rescued, the operation also safeguarded a vital principle. In America, belonging is measured not by ancestry or place of birth, but by the willingness to uphold human dignity and equality. Through their extraordinary actions, the 442nd made this principle tangible. Their legitimacy as Americans was earned through sacrifice, not through declaration, through courage, not through societal acceptance, through deeds, not through mere lineage. This legacy illustrates that the most profound heroism often arises from those whom society has marginalized, that those presumed least loyal may prove most steadfast. and that the true strength of the nation is not uniformity, but a shared dedication to defend ideals greater than any individual or group. The rescue of the lost battalion remains an exceptional moment in U.S. military history. Its significance is measured not only by the tactical accomplishment, but by the character of those who carried it out, and the symbolic weight of their achievement. Over 6 grueling days in October 1944, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team did more than save a battalion. They helped preserve the very vision of what America strives to be.